You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
In 1922, archaeologist Howard Carter discovered the long-lost tomb of King Tutankhamun. The tomb, which had been sealed for more than 3,000 years, is the most intact tomb ever discovered from ancient Egypt. Because of the vast treasures found in the tomb, King Tut has become a household name and has toured the world, fascinating worldwide audiences since his discovery. But the Science Museum show, The Golden King and the Great Pharaohs, features more than Tut. There are many other statues and artifacts from the 18th dynasty. Eva von Dassow, a professor in classical and Near Eastern studies and history at the University of Minnesota, explains more about the history of the 18th dynasty and lesser-known family members of King Tut.
The 18th dynasty, which lasted from roughly the mid-16th century BCE to the mid-14th century, was one of the most glorious periods of Egyptian history. It began with the expulsion of the Hyksos, Syro-Canaanite rulers who set up dynasties in the delta of Egypt, and the early pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, Ahmose, Amenhotep, Thutmose I, and their successors, carried on extensive campaigns in the land of Canaan and also to the south in the land of Nubia and as far south as Kush, thus creating an empire that extended along the length of the Nile from the Fourth Cataract to the Delta and into Canaan as far north as roughly modern Lebanon. And during this period, partly because the Egyptian state now had control of the gold mines of Kush, the Kingdom of Egypt became not merely powerful, but enormously wealthy. And one might even say it became, as it often had been in the past, a sort of fashion center for the ancient world. And Egyptian motifs traveled widely, were emulated widely from Crete to even Armenia. And there was also a growth in, one might say, multiculturalism, if one uses a modern kind of a term, because many non-Egyptians entered Egypt. Egyptians also spent much time, many Egyptians spent time in countries beyond Egypt's natural borders. It became a kind of a cosmopolitan society in some ways, yet retaining a very distinct identity, a very distinct Egyptian identity. In the mid-14th century came the pharaoh who's probably Tutankhamun's father, and that was Amenhotep IV, better known by the name he took a few years after his accession, Akhenaten. Amenhotep IV promulgated a novel religious idea that there was just one God, one divine force, one creator, and that God was manifest in the sun disk, the Aten. It was for this reason that Akhenaten took his new name, changing the theophoric element, the element that names a deity, from Amenhotep, which was his throne name at his accession, to Akhenaten, which was the name that he took. Akhenaten means something approximating beneficial to the Aten. Akhenaten then built a new capital, a new royal city called Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten. It's located at the modern site of El Amarna, roughly midway between Memphis, the old capital, and Thebes, the religious center of the 18th dynasty. Here, at his new city, Akhetaten, Akhenaten, the pharaoh, built temples dedicated to the worship of the Sol god, the solar god, manifest in the sun disk. These were open-air shrines, not closed temple sanctums like which was the normal way to build a temple in most of the ancient world. And Akhenaten also sponsored a completely new style of art in which the royal body is represented almost as androgynous. Instead of the muscular male in the prime of life, which is the figure of an Egyptian king that we become accustomed to for most periods of Egyptian art, Akhenaten is portrayed scrawny with a pot belly and spindly legs and arms and an elongated face and also elongated neck and waist and so forth. And so are all the other members of the royal family. You can imagine that the priests of the traditional gods of Egypt, especially the priests of the solar deity Amun, who was displaced by Aten, the manifestation of the soul deity that Akhenaten worshipped, all of those priests were deprived of royal funding and patronage, and they probably were none too happy about this development. What we can't know is how many normal Egyptians went with Akhenaten, that is, how many of them approved of this heresy, this monotheistic heresy that Akhenaten perpetrated upon Egypt. Akhenaten was succeeded by several of his family members in quick succession. One of them may have been his wife Nefertiti, although it is possible that she predeceased him. Another of his successors probably was one of his daughters, Mary Taten, who would have been perhaps a teenager at the time of her accession. Another was Smenkhare, who may have been a brother of Akhenaten, a much younger brother. Finally, after these, Tutankhaten came to the throne. Notice that I said Tutankhaten. When he was enthroned with a name that celebrated the Aten, the sun disk, the solar deity that was the focus of Akhenaten's novel religion. Only a few years into his reign, however, Tutankhaten, who was enthroned as a boy, perhaps 8 years old, Tutankhaten and his court moved back to Memphis, abandoning the city built by Akhenaten and abandoning the religious heresy that Akhenaten had promulgated. This presumably was not the decision of a 10-year-old or 11-year-old boy. This presumably was a decision of the priesthood of Amun, first and foremost, and the priesthoods of the other gods of Egypt, whose cults had been neglected during the strange time of Akhenaten's reign, and probably of the membership of the Egyptian court, who, we might guess, felt that they could benefit from a restoration of the traditional religion and from the integration of state with temple that had characterized the 18th dynasty prior to Akhenaten's weird idea that there was just one god. So with the move back to Memphis, Tutankhaten's name was changed to Tutankhamun. And then, at the age of perhaps 17, he died, having reigned just about a decade. He was buried, it seems, in some haste, that is to say, the tomb which we celebrate so and which we admire so. We admire the treasures that were not looted and which were therefore left for modern archaeologists to find and for a modern public to see. These were all prepared in, it seems, relative haste, that is, his death was not expected. Examination of his mummy has suggested that he may have suffered from malaria, possibly from a combination of other ailments that, not individually, but together, led to his young death.
Ancient Egyptian museum exhibits have been extremely popular worldwide for decades. There was a very popular King Tut exhibit in the 1970s that actually inspired a popular novelty song in America. Mm-hmm. What causes us to maintain this fascination with ancient Egypt?
Well, we can hold the ancient Egyptians themselves responsible for that. And in particular, their fascination with the afterlife and with preparing for it. Given that it was important for Egyptians to ensure that they could enter the afterlife and live after having died, and it was important for them to make the provision for it by such practices as mummification, producing elaborate tombs as houses for life, for death, and preparing statues through which they could be vivified and through which they could be remembered, inscriptions and so forth. They guaranteed that they would leave evidence of themselves in visible physical form. Their tombs, their statuary, their inscriptions, their monuments. One of the paradoxes of the study of Egyptian archaeology is that we have an awful lot more evidence for how Egyptians died than for how they lived. That is not to say that we don't have evidence of everyday life. We do have towns, we have Egyptian settlements, ancient Egyptian settlements from many periods, documents as well, but the vast majority of our evidence does come from a mortuary context for most periods of ancient Egyptian history. And they also wanted to make this beautiful. Egyptian crafts developed to a very high standard very early on. Writing was invented almost as early as it was in the land of Sumer in southern Iraq. Both writing, literature, and crafts developed to a very high level, in part because Egyptians had the wherewithal to do that, and in part because of the perceived desirability of making things beautiful in order to make themselves, to give themselves a means to inhabit a beautiful world and a beautiful afterlife.
Eva von Dassow, Associate Professor of Classical and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota. Thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thanks again for having me.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.